Stephen, can you talk just real quick?
Testing, testing. Testing.
Yeah, we're good. Yeah, thank you.
Good.
Excellent, thank you. So, I was talking about what's built into the rate models for direct support professionals because the primary determinant of service quality is going to be the folks who are actually delivering the services. So, as I kind of summarized, the rate models themselves include some investments as relates to the compensation package, as relates to additional training. The other thing that we have put forward as part of the draft rate models are tiered rates for DSPs, and some folks were reading ahead yesterday and saw this. And so before I walk through what this recommendation looks like, I think it's important to point out that this also is going to require a fair amount of infrastructure to be built. And so when folks see the fiscal impact analysis that's going to be released on Friday, this is not included as part of that analysis. So this is going to be subject to deliberations in subsequent years. Anything in fiscal year 19-20, we would not anticipate anything related to these tiered DSPs being implemented as part of the fiscal 19-20 budget. So this would require, again, deliberation subsequent to this legislative session. That being said, the concept here is that we want to pay higher rates for DSPs who achieve a higher level of competency. And so you can see that there are some frameworks available nationally. One that we've included on this presentation is something that the National Association of Direct Support Professionals put forward. Now, we're not supposing that you would adopt this specific methodology or the specific curriculum, but it at least provides a framework for what we had in mind when we were building rates to reflect these higher levels of staff. So I'll walk through ever so briefly what NADSP puts forward in terms of certifying folks as DSPs 1, 2, and 3. So the first thing to keep in mind is this is everything above the base DSPs that are built into the rate models. So we spoke yesterday, for example, about that $14.89 wage assumption. That's the base DSP who does not meet the qualifications for any of these three tier categories. Now, in order to achieve DSP level 1, folks have to get 100 hours of training. They have to submit a portfolio that demonstrates competency in a handful of areas, 4 specified areas. And they need at least 1 letter of support from an individual to whom they provide services or a family member of an individual to whom they provide services. And so that's all pretty well structured from what NADSP does. They have a curriculum for achieving 100 hours. They've defined what the competencies are, and they've defined what it takes in order to achieve compliance with that competency. Level 2 builds upon level 1. So that's another 100 hours of training and demonstration of competency in another 4 areas. And then the level 3 DSPs are for folks in specialized areas. So what NADSP has are specialists in the areas of inclusion, health support, employment, positive behavior support, and aging. So the idea in the rate models is that there would be a 3-level system. It may or may not look exactly like this. Again, we want to make sure that folks have an opportunity to weigh in and develop a system that works best for California. But at least for conversation purposes, we put forward this work that NADSP has done in terms of a potential starting point for that conversation. But ultimately, it'll be the responsibility of DDS to develop the regulations that determine what the qualifications are going to be, what the curriculum is going to look like, and how that's going to be tracked on a DSP by DSP basis. In terms of what we built in the rate models to accommodate this, for each subsequent tier, it would be an assumed $1 pay increase. So again, $14.89 is what's built into the base rate model. So for folks who are DSP 1s, they would be at $15.89. DSP 2s would be at $16.89, and DSPs would be at $17.89. We've also built in additional training into the rate model. Again, it's over and above, of course, that 35-hour requirement. And so the concept here really is twofold. The first is to put forward a system that we think will help address the quality of services within the state. Now, this is an indirect measure. It's not measuring any specific, but we are building this on the premise that folks with higher qualifications or more experience and more competence in the area are more likely to produce higher quality services and deliver better outcomes for individuals. And then secondly, we want to continue to recognize the professionalization of the workforce, and this provides a career ladder for DSPs. It gives an opportunity to progress in their career and ultimately get compensated based upon that progression. Again, a lot of work to be done here, but we wanted to provide this framework because we really think this is a really important element of the draft rate models, although it's not something that would be implemented in, again, the coming fiscal year. It would be something that requires a lot of work to be done both between DDS and the community to define what these requirements would look like and ultimately get funded for it in subsequent years.
Dan, Will Sanford with Futures Explored. So in the implementation of this would be just amazingly complex if you were going up and down based on who the DSPs were at any given moment, or how does Burns & Associates see this as being potentially integrated into a rate system that's not always in flux?
So folks wouldn't be going down, of course, right? I mean, once the DSP achieves that certification, they're going to have that certification. But it is going to require some thought in terms of what that looks like really from a service authorization perspective as much as anything else. When someone achieves that certification, is it going to be tracked by a different service code or subcode that requires a different authorization in order to accommodate that? Or is it possible to use the authorization and claims payment processing system where it can be billed by folks at any of those levels? So for example, we have draft rate models for tiered DSPs for independent living. So base model, DSP 1, 2, and 3. Is it possible to establish an authorization that allows billing for any of those 4 levels? Or would it require a revision to that authorization, say now we're receiving services from the DSP 1? I don't have the answer to that technological question. We've had some conversation about it, but that is, I think, one of the complexities that would delay the rollout of this potential recommendation. The other thing that we've given some preliminary thought to, but this would be ultimately codified in some sort of regulation, is how to do this for group-based services, residential and day programs in particular, right? So in a residential program, you don't typically have a DSP working with an individual. You have a group of DSPs working with a group of individuals. So our thought there is we'd have a threshold where a certain number of DSPs, or really the percentage of work hours in a day program or residential program, have that DSP qualification, and then therefore that entire rates can be billed at the DSP 1 level. So let me use residential as an example. So a really simple residential model assumes 168 hours per week, right? And then that's reimbursed on a monthly basis, so that comes out to a little bit north of 600 hours. What we've built in the rate models is the assumption that to build the DSP 1 rate, 60% of those DSP hours have to be delivered by someone with a DSP 1 qualification. In order to build a DSP 2 rate, at least 60% of those 600 hours have to be provided by someone with a DSP 2 qualification. So again, that's what's predicated in the rate model, although, as I've said a couple of times, this would require quite a bit of fleshing out in terms of a regulatory framework to accommodate that. And it's a similar concept on the day program side as well, that we'd be looking at the total day program, the total DSP hours within the day program over the course of probably a month, the way hours are currently tracked. And they have to achieve some sort of threshold. 60% of those hours would have to be delivered by someone with the qualification for which you're billing the rate.
Okay, the other one that clearly that would impact directly would be, I mean, you've already talked about increasing the program operations funding, but the administrative tracking of that is going to be substantial because it's going to a whole new system. You know, we're already talking about going to primarily hourly billing, plus having to track this. I mean, the administrative load on an organization of any size is going to be pretty substantial. Would have to be factored into that rate model also.
And I understand the point that you're raising, and in the interest of transparency right now, the premium is built in for those DSPs 1, 2s, and 3s do not include any additional administrative funding.
I think that I'm really glad you're including this because I do think that professionalizing the DSP workforce is essential for retention, in addition to wages, because yeah, it's just gonna take more than that. And I'm just curious, have you made this recommendation elsewhere, and has it been implemented, and how, if so, how has that gone?
It's actually relatively novel. So we've not made this specific recommendation. We did do some research about what other states are doing. And we haven't seen another state that is, and that's not saying it doesn't exist, but based upon our research, we have not seen another state that's doing something that's quite this broad-based. One example of something that is done on a much smaller scale is in Pennsylvania. Not a state that I've worked in, so I'm not speaking with authority in terms of what those rates actually do. But having read some of the regulations, having some conversations with people there, they have two tiers. They have a base rate and they have an enhanced rate. And the enhanced rate can be folks who have a variety of different qualifications in order to access that. It could be based upon someone having a CNA, an RBT, or achieving one of these, I think, NADSP qualifications. There's also another four-letter acronym that I don't remember right now for folks who have a specialization in people with co-occurring conditions of behavioral health and intellectual developmental disability. So if they have any of those qualifications, the direct care worker can bill at the enhanced rate if it's approved for that specific person. So that's one of the specific differences between what we're proposing and what's being done in Pennsylvania, is we've made the assumption that everyone in the state can benefit from staff with higher qualifications, whereas in Pennsylvania, the people who have access to that enhanced rate is limited based upon some specific needs. If you are someone who's relatively capable, you can't get the enhanced rate, whereas here, it's based upon not just the person's eligibility, it's based upon the staff person having that qualification. So in terms of a broad-based system where it applies across the board to all consumers within a program, I'm not aware of a state that's doing something like this.
I see. And does the NADSP make any recommendations for infrastructure, provide any support for providers who want to implement this separate from funding? Just do you know if they have any resources available for that?
I can't speak in detail about that, but it is, I think, a provider-focused organization. So there is a lot of infrastructure around it. In terms of the specific technical assistance they might provide, I can't speak to that.
Jordan Lindsay with the ARC of California. Also want to reiterate, very appreciative of the consideration and professionalizing the workforce and creating a path for that. Whether it's an NADSP model or some other model, I hope that we as a community move in that direction. Just to be totally clear about what's delivered Friday, I'm still a little unclear of, is it a line item included in the models that can be considered for discussion, or what exactly will be included on Friday?
Are you speaking in relation to like the potential cost, or just showing what the rate would be? So I'll probably answer the question, and then if I don't answer it, you can follow us. So what will be included in the report on Friday as relates to this specific element of the report is what the rate would be for DSP 1s, 2s, 3s for each of the services to which this would apply. So I mentioned a moment ago, it would apply to independent living services. So we'll have, this is the base rate for independent living, and this is the DSP 1 rate for independent living, DSP 2, DSP 3. That is what will be included. There will also be a very clear statement that that is not included in part of the as part of the fiscal impact. That's going to be reported there as well. And we don't have that number right now because it's going to require some rather heroic assumptions about the take-up rate and how quickly providers would adopt this and ultimately get people through the certification program.
So there will be a broad fiscal impact included in the report on Friday, but not including if we adopted something like this.
This specific element is the one thing that's not included as part of that fiscal impact analysis. Everything else that we're going to be talking about today is included as part of that estimate. And again, the reasons for that are twofold. The first is the fact that we're going to have to work with DDS and likely work with the union in terms of what the phase and schedule is likely to look like. And then furthermore, we just know that it's not feasible in the first year, right? I mean, there's so much infrastructure that has to be built, as Will brought up, and we're not understating the level of complication this is going to add, but we also think it's an important element of the recommendation. We think it's going to have a longer fuse in order to get there. But we wanted to put the recommendation forward so folks can begin deliberating on it, because again, this is something that's going to take more than a month or two of thought. It's going to probably take a full year to think about what that infrastructure looks like, both on the provider side as well as on the state side.
One question we had on the base level DSP from yesterday, and this sort of would address it in some form going forward, but all of us have long-term staff who have significant skills and certification, et cetera, who would not be a base level person to start with. Does the rate model factor in any of that that we have already wage differentials within our DSPs?
So that's a good question, and one of the points that I was planning to make today, but I should have made yesterday, was when we look at the assumptions in the rate model, they're not prescriptive, right? So our assumption is that we built a $14.89 wage. Someone who's new to the job might be brought in at $14 an hour, and someone who's been on the job might be brought in at $16 an hour. That really is intended to represent the average wage across the workforce. And and then I'm not sure that you answered this question directly, but in terms of whether or not this proposal includes consideration of people's experience, the answer is right now no. But again, we're presenting a specific framework. That's something that certainly I think can be deliberated further in terms of whether or not there ought to be any sort of experience offset to the training requirements. If someone's been in the job for 10 years, is that going to be deemed to be equivalent to the 100 hours of training that this framework would call for?
Right, although in the NASDP, I can't say the initials, it has pretty specific competencies it's looking for, so you'd have to be able to demonstrate those either through experience or otherwise, so you might be able to achieve it that way. I think the other one, so if the wage being proposed is that the midpoint DSP range? I mean, going back to yesterday when you're talking about, so in any given service category, the wage for $14.89, is that sort of a midpoint? I mean, you don't talk about what the upper lower on that range would be.
And certainly I don't have any specific proposal about what the upper or lower range would be. It's intended to represent, as we say, the typical cost or the reasonable cost of delivering a service. We recognize, though, that you're going to have folks who earn more and folks that earn less. So that's supposed to be the reasonable, and you could call it the average cost for a direct care worker. So with that then, what we were going to do is transition to the specific rate models. And as folks have seen in our previous meetings, we've grouped services into 4 categories. Again, this is our grouping. It's for convenience purposes for us to be able to keep our thoughts organized. So the 4 groups of services that we've created are personal supports and training, which is what we'll talk about first, residential services, day employment and transportation, and then the 4th and final grouping is professional and behavioral support services. So we're going to start with personal supports and training. For each of these sections of the presentation, you'll see we begin with a grid that crosswalks the services that exist today to what the recommendation or the draft rate models presume. And this is really an illustration of where we're proposing things to either be consolidated or in some cases to be broken apart. And so if you look at this grid, you have the existing personal assistance service, and that would remain a personal assistance service. And we're not making assumptions about whether or not the service codes themselves will or will not change. Same thing is true with parent-coordinated personal assistance. That right now exists under 093. We continue to have a parent-coordinated personal assistance service. But if you look at the next section, we're proposing the consolidation of a number of different service codes, or at least elements of service codes, into a single service. In particular, 055 and 063, when it's delivered primarily in a home or the community on a one-to-one basis, that would be wrapped into the independent living service, as well as the existing 520 independent living program code, as well as 645 mobility training services. So there's a single rate model that accommodates independent living. And again, the premise here is that 055 and 063 would be eliminated altogether, and their existing rates or services would be farmed out to the corresponding services that exist under the non-miscellaneous service code. So again, based upon the conversations that we've had with this group over the months, or more than a year now, we understand that those codes are delivered sometimes for in-home types of supports, and that's where they would be moved to independent living. They're delivered sometimes as look-alike day programs, so they would be moved into our day program framework. And they're used to provide employment supports, and they would be moved to the 950 series codes. So in this particular case, the elements of 055 and 063 that are in-home supports, equivalent to independent living, would be moved to the new independent living service. Similarly with mobility training, we view that as a subset of skills building for independent living services. So rather than having a standalone service code, it would be subsumed under a broader independent living categorization. It remains a question whether or not there would be, say, a subcode to track the use of that specific modality or not. But from a rate perspective, the rate would be the same. It would be a rate for independent living regardless of what it is you're doing. If it's what exists today is independent living or what exists today is mobility training. And again, I won't go through all of these in detail, but part of that consideration process was a review of the service requirements and then a look at utilization. So I have to believe that every regional center is helping people access the community or access transportation, but when you look at the billing information, I think fewer than half of them actually do any billing under mobility assistance because it's being delivered under another service code. And as I mentioned yesterday, one of our overarching recommendations here is to standardize and simplify, consistent with the requirements of ABX 2.1. And this, we think, is an opportune example of achieving that. So a service should be billed under the same service code regardless of where that service is delivered, whereas right now we can have the same service and the service code is going to vary from one regional center to the next. Similar premise for the independent living specialist, the mobility training specialist, we rolled into that rate. For supported living, a relatively modest change on 894 and 896. So right now, some regional centers use 894 for the administrative components of supported living. Our rate model includes those administrative costs, so we don't see need for 894 to exist as a standalone code. So that would be eliminated. But then more foundationally, again, based upon conversations we had with this group, we identified two primary ways that supported living is being delivered on a kind of one-to-one basis, or at least within one housing unit behind one front door. So you might have roommates that are being supported by a single staff person, but that staff person is not responsible for anybody else while they're delivering services within that unit. And then the other model is what I typically have referred to as the apartment complex model, where you have staff who float from one person to the next. And so we would reimburse those through a different means. We'd have a monthly rate for that shared or community model is what we're calling it, and then an hourly reimbursement for the individualized or one-to-one services or that behind that single front door service. So what you'll see in this portion of the presentation is supported living that's delivered behind that single front door, which based upon our conversations, the provider survey results is our understanding of the primary way that supported living is delivered in the state. Moving on to the next page, you'll see that for tutoring services, we would combine the two existing tutor service codes, 025 and 680, into a single tutoring tutor service. For in-home respite, we would actually pull the employer of record out and move that to a participant-directed respite code. And then what would be left in 862 is agency respite. We'd combine a number of different participant-directed type respite services, those delivered under 420, 465, and 864 into a single service. The existing homemaker services, technically there's two, but there's, I believe, zero billing under 858, so we would eliminate that and combine them into a single housekeeping code, which we'll come back to later in this presentation. And then we have, of course, the supplemental program support, which is used to augment each of the additional services here.
Eric Zickman, Golden Gate Regional Center. Just up on the independent living versus the independent living specialist, does that have to do with, what does that have to do with? I don't want to make an assumption. Why did you break those two apart, where one's a program and one's a, presumably maybe delivered by an individual? They're both one-to-one services, it looks like.
So they were broken apart already, so we didn't make any change. I mean, they currently exist as two different service codes, and we're maintaining the differentiation between the agency and the specialist or more, I guess, sole practitioner type of business model. I'm not sure if that's the question you're asking, because we didn't make the change. I mean, that already exists. And so if you look at if you compare one rate model to the next, we have a reduced, if not eliminated, funding for administration program operations on the specialist side because they don't have an agency infrastructure around.
Okay, that was my question. Thanks.
But I do think that that's a valid conversation to have in terms of what the differences are in the expectations, if any, between agency services versus specialist services. And so that grid is just a quick crosswalk of the existing service codes to what's included in the draft rate models. We will now walk through each of those individually. Before I walk through the PowerPoint, what we wanted to do is we wanted to flip over to one rate model. that falls within this category. So the way I intend to handle today is not to walk through 2,100 pages of rate models, but to walk through a rate model that is representative of a group of services. So what you see projected up on the screen now is what I had excerpted in the PowerPoint presentation yesterday, and this is for the independent living service. So I'll spend some time walking through this rate model, but then I am not going to be walking through the rate model for, say, tutor service or parent support service, because once you know how to read, so to speak, this rate model, you know how to read the other rate models. The numbers in there are different, but you're going to understand where those numbers came from and where to look for them. And that's just the way that we can get this done in a day and a half rather than a week. So starting at the top, and we covered a lot of this yesterday, these are relatively, from a rate modeling perspective, relatively straightforward. Anytime you have a one-to-one service delivered in the community, there's only a handful of assumptions you need to make. The first is the wage assumption. And so as we spoke about at some length yesterday, that's built on a $14.89 per hour. That's the BLS data, adjusted for minimum wage and or regular wage inflation, and then based upon our assumption about the appropriate mix of standard occupational classifications that build up to this specific regional center service. And so what I'll do to illustrate this, and this part of the conversation will take longer, we'll get quicker as the day goes on, is flip over to the appendices and show you exactly how to read Appendix B for deriving that rate model assumption. So what you see here is the list of BLS occupations. Someone asked yesterday about how we chose the occupations. I told you it's based upon the work that we've done over the years, having reviewed the descriptions of each of these classifications and making a determination about which ones we think are relevant to home and community-based services. So rather than publishing the 800 plus SOCs in our packet, we published the 40 or so that we think have some relevancy to this industry. Everything that you see on this page, anyone else could produce themselves by going to the BLS's website. So reading from left to right, you have the SOC, their nomenclature. The first two numbers are the industry, the last four numbers are the occupation. Then you have the title itself. So looking at the very top, we have a training and development manager, and that's under SOC 113131. The BLS also publishes the typical education, experience, and training requirements associated with staff in that position. So you can see for that specific occupation at the top of the page, folks typically have a bachelor's degree. They typically have 5 years of experience, and there is no on-the-job training typically required. And then the remaining columns are the wage levels in the BLS survey. So again, it's based upon a survey delivered to employers here in the state of California, then BLS analyzes the data, and they report wages at a variety of different levels. So you have the 10th percentile, which means that 90% of folks earn more than that amount, so that's kind of the low end of the wage scale. The 25th percentile, the 50th percentile, which is also the median, which is half the folks in that occupation make more, half the folks make less. The 75th and the 90th percentile, the 90th percentile, of course, being the high end of the range, it means only 10% of the people in that particular occupation make more than that amount. So this is no manipulation on our part. The only thing that we've done is filter the list, so we're not going to do 800 occupations. It's our list of occupations that we think are relevant. But all this information is from the BLS's website. This is nothing has been adjusted in any way at this point. So anyone can validate any of these numbers themselves. You find exactly these figures and that information about the training and education requirements yourselves. And then what we've done here is just reproduce the table we saw in the PowerPoint presentation. So that shows you that the best term I've come up with is capture rate for each dollar above the existing minimum wage. So we spent some time talking about that yesterday. I won't belabor that point. And at the bottom of the page, you'll see the adjustment that we made for the generalized wage inflation with the citation to where that data came from. The Bureau of Economic Analysis assumes 3.6% growth in net earnings here in California. So we increased the wages to get from May of 2017 to January of 2020, or the midpoint of the coming fiscal year. Again, although you don't see that in the rate models itself, we ran both of these calculations against every one of the BLS wages and chose the higher of the two results. So they either got a minimum wage adjustment or a generalized wage inflation adjustment, and the inflection point was $15 an hour specifically, right? If it was less than $15 an hour wage, it was adjusted for the minimum wage. If it was more than $15, it was given this 9.89% rating or wage increase.
Stephen, are these California or national?
Which figures?
The page B1.
Yeah, absolutely. These are California-specific figures.
'Cause, 'cause, 'cause page B1, the, the, the page B1, the, 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 the,
So this page now works through the math that we just talked about. So we ran that analysis, minimum wage adjustment, based upon our assumption about that compression factors and the spillover effects, and then the 9.89% generalized inflation. So what we produced here now is our adjusted BLS number. So now at this point, you're not going to be able to reproduce this on your own. You can reproduce it using the methodology on the previous page, but this now is our figures. Starting with BLS, we're making adjustments to account for a rising minimum wage, as well as inflation that's occurred since May of 2017. So the same list of occupations, just updating those wage assumptions based upon the decision rules we've talked about. This page shows the weighting of services or the mix of occupations that we've used to build up a wage assumption for an individual service code. So we talked yesterday already what we've done for independent living services. The biggest weight, the majority of the weight, is for the personal care aides because that's where DSPs currently live in the BLS architecture. But then we also wanted to take into account some of the other responsibilities that folks have. So we added 15% for medical assistance type of occupation, behavioral support. And it's the third column over so that folks are reading. So home health aid at 15%, the psychiatric aid at 15%, and then the recreation work at 15%. To get, of course, to 100% bottom line. You'll notice in a handful of cases, we were able to use a single occupational classification. So I think that's for tutoring services. That teacher-instructor category, we thought was a good fit for tutoring services, so we didn't have to do any other sort of weighting. But for most, particularly for most of the big spending items, we did a weight across a variety of different standard occupational classifications. And then this page is the mathematical culmination of the preceding two pages. So again, just to recap how this went in order, we took the BLS wages, we adjusted for minimum wage or inflation, and then we weighted those adjusted wages based upon our assumption about what an appropriate mix of occupations is to reflect the requirements of a given service. And so this just does the math of the previous two pages. Based upon the adjusted BLS wages and the assumed job mix, what is the resultant wage? So you'll see again in that third column in for independent living, we're at $14.89, just like we spoke about at some length yesterday. What we've also included here is what the values are for those categories A, B, and C. So we talked about that 95% adjustment for category A takes the assumption down to $14.15. Category B at 100%, of course, stays $14.89, and category C at 115% increases to $17.12. So I'm not going to go through the assumptions on a service-by-service basis that we've built in for the wages, but I wanted to walk through this appendix so that you can review that on your time as you're considering your comments. If there's something that you think you would offer as a counter to what we've built in, you know how now to look through this appendix for you to see where those numbers were derived from. So anytime you look at a rate model and you want to know where that wage came from, you can go back to the appendix to see the specific buildup of it.
Given that this is California's numbers, was there any consideration given to the fact that those of us who receive the surveys from the BLS are giving data that is from frozen and cut rates over the years?
So, no, we didn't make any specific adjustments on that factor, but that goes back to part of the reason we use the BLS data is it's not limited to folks in the IDD field. So that personal care assistance, actually more folks than not work outside of the IDD field. So, for example, there's going to be a significant component of nursing homes. It's in a lot of measures. There's a significant private sector for nursing homes, as an example.
But it does include it.
So the BLS wages would absolutely include information from folks in the IDD field, but it's certainly not limited to that as a cross-industry perspective.
Thank you.
Stephen, just a quick thing from the people watching, wanted to know what pages we're on.
Thank you. And so I appreciate the question, and I wish I had a better answer. I have the page numbers written down for all the rate models that we'll be talking about for the appendices, though I don't. Oh, Carl can tell me what. No, we don't. We can't. This is an excerpt.
5 out of 16.
It is B5, but it's going to be towards the very end of the rate model packet, and it's 2,100 pages long. So that the B5 is not going to be helpful. Thank you. 1611.
1611, yeah.
Lena Hooper, could I see the footnote where there's one like psychiatrist is set at $50 and there's a footnote? It's the other way. We just went by it.
It's the very first page, and that has to do with so the two footnotes on there. The first is, for reasons that are unclear to me, the BLS does not report wage data when it's above $100 per hour. So you'll see that footnote applies. Is the title on this example? Yeah, for psychiatrists. Fortuitously, we're not setting a psychiatrist rate. Right? So the reason that you don't have a wage value there is because the BLS doesn't report it.
So is the implication that someone could actually hire a psychiatrist for $45.77?
Well, the implication is that there are 10% of psychiatrists who earn an average of $46 per hour. But 90% of psychiatrists are earning more than that amount. But we don't know how much. I mean, and it's clearly going to be a pretty quick ramp up, right? Because you go from 46 to something that's north of $100. I don't know how far north, but at the 25th percentile, you're already at least $100.
So what would be plugged into the rate model?
Well, we would have to, in that particular case, we would have to find an alternative source of information. But again, we don't have a psychiatrist rate, so we didn't have to cross that particular bridge. We've done that in other states where we've done, say, rates for behavioral health setting, and we've looked at other sources of information from a published perspective. Because psychiatrists, this is typically going to be the case in most states. At the median, they're earning more than $100 per hour. So the BLS, again, I don't know why, but they won't report that data out. And then the second footnote relates to how you have to address teachers. The BLS does not report an hourly wage for teachers. It's an annual amount. You have to make an assumption on how many hours per year a teacher works. It's not typically going to be 2,080. It's not a 52-week work year. So I think we used an assumption of 1,600 hours per year. Again, because we're not setting rates for teachers, it's informative but not particularly relevant. Again, we just wanted to be thorough in terms of the occupations that we've used at one time or another in rate setting work, but these occupations aren't being used here for any of our specific draft rate models. So again, I don't have the page numbers for the appendices of the PDF, but for those folks who got to page 1611, if you start scrolling forward, you're pretty quickly going to run into Appendix C. And so the bottom page will be C1. As you can see, there's a lot of pages. Here we go. So I won't spend a lot of time on this because all the details we presented yesterday, but this is the detail behind those benefit rates. So what we've included on here are a couple different data points, the BLS data when it's available and relevant. So for example, there's no BLS data to tell us what the Social Security payroll tax is because everyone knows what the Social Security payroll tax is. But in terms of what we've included on this specific page, I'll walk through health insurance because that's the most illustrative example. So the first set of columns, if you scroll back up a little bit so we can see, okay, good, that's fine. Just scroll up so that people can see health insurance. So the first set of columns is effectively the offer rate, what percentage of folks have access to that particular benefit. So in the BLS data, it's across the private sector workforce, and 70% of employees in the private sector have access to employer-sponsored health insurance. That is to say, their employer offers it to them. The next set of, and then from our rate modeling perspective, we're assuming that the rate models are sufficient for all 100% of agencies to be offering health insurance to their staff. The next column relates to the take-up rate. And so that's why health insurance is a good example. You might offer your staff health insurance, but it's unlikely that everyone that you employ takes you up on that health insurance, right? Because they could have health insurance through their spouse, they could have it through the Veterans Administration, they could have it through Medicare. There's a number of other, or there could be young invincibles who just decide that they'll forego health insurance and in the previous years pay the payroll tax, and now they don't have, for the income tax, now they don't even have to do that. So they just decline health insurance and risk it, so to speak. And so when you look across the entire private sector, the take-up rate for health insurance, when it's offered to you, is 77%. And so you take those two figures, a 70% offer rate and a 77% take-up rate, and that means 54% of folks in the workforce, according to the BLS, have employer-sponsored health insurance. What we built into the rate model, again, is a 100% offer rate and an 80% take-up rate, and those figures are obviously higher than what is reported in the private sector, and also a pretty healthy premium above what's built into the rate models, what we found in the provider survey. I don't have the specific figures in front of you. We included in the reports we released on Friday. We're like 25 or 30 percentage points higher than was reported in the provider survey in terms of that coverage rate or that participation rate. And then the next set of columns is the average cost of health insurance. Again, the intent here is to reflect an employee-only plan and the employee share of that plan. So the rate model is based upon $450. We had some questions yesterday about the numbers that we use as a basis for that. So what you see here is the BLS figure of $453. There's a footnote that also talks about the other sources of information I mentioned. So we also mentioned we looked at MEPS data, or Medical Expenditure Panel Survey from federal DHHS, as well as information about health insurance that's offered through the exchanges here in the States, based upon Kaiser Family Foundation's analysis. And so we couldn't fit that all in the grid, but that is included in the footnote. And then the last set of columns is what the effective cost is, right? So we have $450 per month per employee for those who participate, but we are not assuming 100% participation rate. We're assuming an 80% participation rate, which means the rate model is funded at $360 per employee per month. Because some folks who the cost will be zero, and for some folks, we're assuming the cost will be $450. I think everything else in here is reasonably straightforward in terms of the reading the table. At the top, we have those payroll taxes, like Social Security, Medicare, federal and state unemployment insurance, and then the employer training tax that is mostly unique to California, although other states have similar taxes. And then outside of those, we have 25 days of paid leave, broken out between, we're assuming 10 holidays and 15 vacation and sick days. And then we add $100 per month for every employee for other benefits offered at the employer's discretion. So that could be a retirement contribution, it could be life or dental insurance, it could be disability coverage, it could be an EAP, tuition assistance, etc. And so we assume 100% participation rate or take-up rate there. We wanted to provide a full $100 for all employees. The next page translates that to a benefit rate. So again, ground that we covered yesterday, we translate those assumptions to a benefit rate based upon the wage that the individual earns. And we talked about that inverse relationship. The higher the wage, the lower the benefit rate. Everyone gets the same benefit package, exactly what you saw on page C1, but what that translates to in terms of a percentage of their total compensation goes down as their wage goes up. And that's what this table shows you. Yesterday I showed you a graphical representation of that, right? The curve goes down. You have a lower benefit rate as that wage increases. And then finally, for this particular appendix, we have the workers' compensation assumptions. So what we've done here is lined up our service names, so that's what you see on the left-hand side, as well as the service codes to which we assume the existing service codes to which it applies. We have the workers' compensation class code from the WCIRB, or Workers' Compensation Insurance Rating Bureau. We have what their advisory pure premium amount is. That includes the adjustments. Is that in the footnote for the 11.5%, I think? Or perhaps I was in California, maybe it's on the last page of this, because I think you went from the first page. But we took the advisory pure premium amounts, we reduced them by 11.5% based upon historical trends, and then we added 12% for the insurer's administrative costs. So again, folks would obviously can take a look at this from the services you deliver to see how close or not we've hit the mark in terms of what those assumptions look like. I will say that on workers' compensation, the aggregate rate that we built in the rate models is somewhat less than what was reported in the provider survey. That makes some intuitive sense because the premium share, the premium is comprised of two costs, right? You have the indemnity, the lost wages, and that will go up as someone's wage goes up. So if they're making $11 a day and make $14 tomorrow, the cost of that component of the rate will increase. But the other component of that is the medical services cost, and that's not going to increase as fast as wages are increasing because no one's getting 30% wage increase like they are on the minimum wage side. So again, based upon historical patterns and the fact that the wage base is going up so quickly in the rate models, we put in that 11.5% reduction to trend it forward to January of 2020. But the result is somewhat less than what was included in the, or reported in the provider survey. That takes us to Appendix D. Again, this one is probably the least impactful appendix to be aware of because we report everything that's here really on the rate models themselves. But I'll just walk top to bottom in terms of the premise. So the first thing that we do is we build a typical work week for a staff person, and just like we're assuming on the benefits side, we're not discounting for part-time staff, we're also not discounting productivity for part-time staff either. So we're assuming a 40-hour work week for folks that are delivering services. And then we make assumptions about what they're doing during that typical work week. So independent living is at the very far right-hand part of this page. So you'll see that we're assuming that they're spending about an hour and a half per week traveling from one individual to the next. And a portion of that's because these are relatively long encounters. When we look at the length of a typical encounter, it seems like people are oftentimes only working with a single person during their shift. So in that case, there really is very little travel time, if any, because no one gets paid to commute. You don't get paid to go to your first location, you don't get paid to go home. So overall, we saw relatively modest travel for this particular service based upon the provider survey results. Then we build in time for record keeping and reporting, an hour per week, and an hour for supervision and other employee attending. So that means out of that 40-hour work week, we're left with the assumption that they're doing 36.5 hours of billable service. However, then we need to account for irregular activities that they are performing. And so there's two categories for that, training and paid time off. And so paid time off is not going to be part of someone's typical work week because we usually don't take 2 hours off per week. We take a day or a week off at a time. So again, our assumption is that folks are getting 200 hours of paid leave, 25 days times 8 hours, 200 hours per year, and we have to spread that across the 52-week year. Same thing is true for training. As we said, we built in 35 hours per year for training. That's not part of someone's typical work week, right? You don't typically go for 1 hour of training per week. You do training for a day or two at a time. So over the course of an entire year, we have 35 hours built in for training. So we'll simply spread that 235 hours across each of the other assumptions and scale them down appropriately or commensurately. And so now you'll see that in that 40-hour work week, we're assuming that folks are doing billable services for 32 hours because that now has spread across the training and paid time off across that work week over an entire 52-week year.
Michelle from On My Own. One thing that isn't considered in the typical work week is the overtime. And I'm curious because there are wage orders that are aligned with certain service codes 18113, 062, 055, 110. The wage orders are pretty clear that we have to pay overtime past the 8th hour of the day, sometimes even double time. And I'm just curious, with so much thought given to some of the other costs, such as travel distance and travel time, the compression issue, which we really appreciate. I'm just curious why such a large cost to us as vendors wasn't considered here in the typical work week.
So understand the wage orders, but there's not a requirement that people have more than an 8-hour workday either. So we're not making the assumption that folks have to work more than 8 hours.
But I think you could make the assumption with the unemployment rate being down, I think you could see a correlation with our overtime rates being higher.
So understand the point. And as I mentioned yesterday, we don't have overtime built into rate models with the exception of some of the residential service codes.
Residential 896, I think there's several that we're just, our hands are tied. We have to provide that overtime. It's an unanticipated cost that we all experience. And I think to leave it out is to make the assumption that we wouldn't have to provide that service if an employee didn't show up for their shift. It's just a very real situation that we're in with some of our service codes. It needs to be considered.
Thank you. So as I mentioned yesterday, as it relates to productivity, again, it varies certainly from one service to the next, but as a general rule, our productivity assumptions are more generous. That is, more non-billable time is built in than what we saw in the provider survey.
Just a quick note on the ILS. I don't know if I want to speak to personal attendant and other services, but I'm a bit surprised to see only an hour and 50 an hour and a half of travel time in between appointments. You're saying long appointments? That's not how these typical ILS services that I'm aware of function. Generally, it's 2 hours or so, serving multiple people. So at 40 hours, I can't imagine only an hour and a half of travel time. So.
Will Sanford, Futures Expert. The other one is this assumes that all staff are equally productive. Right? Clearly, you have people who are new staff. 35 hours of training is in there, but there's also a lot of pretty intensive orientation, prep, and training time on the front end of that, where they may be billing almost no time or very little time to get there. So, is there any kind of factor that allows for new staff, especially as noted, we have high turnover and bringing staff on a regular basis?
So the answer to that question is really the same as the answer to the question on the wages. This is intended to represent a reasonable overall approximation of what the staff person is able to bill for. So some folks are likely to be billing more than 32 hours, and some folks are likely to be billing less than 32 hours. 32 hours is the overall expectation of the rate models themselves. So there's not an allowance outside the training built in for the issues that you raised. So the question really is that 35 hours adequate or not?
One more thing on ILS. Eric Sigmund. Is there a place where we can see what the provider rate study, because I assume the provider rate study in the ILS section had a travel time in it? Is that published anywhere, or is that?
It is. I don't have it with me here
so
today.
we can compare those.
And that's previously been distributed. So the last time that we got together as a rates work group, again, it was another massive packet of information that was included in that analysis.
Great, thank you.
So that takes us through the appendices that I wanted to cover at the moment. We'll circle to the final appendix E towards the end of the day, I think. So we'll move back to the rate model itself. So again, start with the wage assumption, the 1489. We talked about where that was derived from. The benefit rate of 26.4%. But you'll see that that excludes a couple of things, because people oftentimes react pretty quickly to that particular number. It excludes workers' compensation, which for this particular service is assumed to be another 4.2%. So that's a total benefit rate of a little north of 30%. And then furthermore, paid time off is not part of that benefit rate. It's handled as a productivity adjustment. Again, I shared with you the rationale for that yesterday. And the bottom line from a rate model perspective is it does produce marginally higher rates, including as productivity, rather than as part of the benefit rate. So I know some folks think about it differently and include that as part of your benefit rates. But we continue to think it makes more sense as a productivity adjustment, a reduction in billable work hours, and it does have the impact of positively benefiting the bottom line. And then from here, yes.
This Carol McKinney, this might have the same answer as you just gave Eric. And in the provider survey, is the base model hour available as well? The results of the provider survey. So how does the 1489 compare to the provider survey?
Absolutely. So yes, that specific number, a big part of the analysis packet is the average wage reported to us for a direct care worker in each of the service codes.
So it's in there, but that's not necessarily the number.
These numbers are going to be higher than that.
Okay.
Yeah. Again, it's because we've accounted, that goes back to the whole premise of the approach that we take to rate setting, is that we don't want to rely only on the provider survey, because those wages reflect not a $13 minimum wage, it reflects a lower minimum wage. It also reflects constraints that you have on you in terms of the rates that you're currently being paid. So I can't say this with 100% confidence that every single one of our wage assumptions is higher than what was reported in the provider survey, but it's going to be the vast majority of them are higher than what was reported.
Thank you.
And again, I mean, we try to provide some context as we walk through this presentation. Our wage assumptions are almost always going to be higher. Our benefit assumptions are going to be higher. Our productivity, generally speaking, is higher. Program operations, higher. Administration is flat, as we spoke about yesterday. Again, those are the general takeaways. Can people find exceptions to those rules? Absolutely. But as a general hypothesis, that's how our 5 core assumptions are going to compare to what was reported in the provider survey. So from here, then we have the mileage that's built into the rate model, 100 miles per week per direct care worker. So usually I have someone that quickly points out you built in an hour and a half, and it's actually adjusted downwards from that hour and a half for travel time, but 100 miles, are you expecting people to drive 80 miles per hour? And the answer to that question is no, of course not. But that mileage is not just the time associated with traveling from the office to an individual or from one individual to the next. It also includes the time when people are being transported in the community. And so that's billable hours, so that doesn't show up as a productivity adjustment because you're billing for that time. So if you recall from the provider survey, for most of the service codes, we actually asked you to differentiate what's the typical mileage driven for to and from versus the mileage transporting. And so that this number is a composite of both of those figures. So if folks who want to divide the mileage by the travel time are certainly welcome to do so, but those numbers are not directly comparable. We move on. Yes.
Hi, Stephen. This is Joy with the California Respite Association, and we have some concerns about the mileage being put in the hourly rate and not being able to bill it separately because we base on aligning workers with the family's needs, so the mileage may be more for some and less for others, and I'm concerned that that's going to cut into how we are able to provide services.
Sure. So I understand the point, and just for the group to be clear, that's what's being proposed would be the elimination of billing specifically for mileage or for travel time. That would all be incorporated into the direct service rates based upon the assumptions that you see here. So that, you're right, that's what's assumed, that it would be a change for some services to what current practice is. And in terms of the assumptions in here, it's the same, I'm becoming a little bit of a broken record of the same point that I made before. What we built in here is supposed to be a typical approximation, but as you pointed out, some folks are going to have less travel associated, and other folks are going to have more. We think this is an appropriate average.
Thank you.
We move on to supervision, which we shared a fair amount of conversation about yesterday. So you'll see the wage assumption that we built in, although apparently unpopular. We have $21 per hour currently funded, so about $42,000, $43,000 per year. Because we're not assuming, again, just like we talked about for direct care workers a moment ago, we're not assuming that supervisors are required to work overtime. Benefit package for supervisors is exactly the same as the benefit package for direct care workers. Again, the benefit rate is going to vary because our wage is higher, but the package itself is the same. Workers' compensation is going to be aligned. And then we have that span of control of 1 to 10, so 1 supervisor for every 10 direct care workers. From here, we have program operations and administration. So program operations is funded at that $10 per day. Again, we have the series of decision rules in the presentation yesterday. This falls into that first decision rule. This is a typically one-to-one service that has a supervision component built in, and therefore gets the $10 per day per direct care worker. And then we add all of those costs up: wages and benefits, adjusted for productivity, mileage, supervision, program operations. That gives us the cost basis, and then we apply a 12% factor to that. And the 12% factor is actually 12% of the total cost, not just the base cost. So that gives us, in this case, an extra $4.19. So the bottom line for this rate model is $34.89 when we add up all of those components. So if you roll back up, again, I'm not going to walk through each of the, yes?
Amy Westling, Association of Regional Center Agencies. So could you repeat what you just said about the components of the rate that then feed into the 12% administrative assumption?
So yeah, at times folks will take the total cost base and then multiply by 12%, but that means you're not giving them an effective 12% rate, right? So rather than doing that, the math is we say what would be 12% of the resultant total. So kind of the bottom line to think about it is the overall rate is $34.89. Of that, 12% is for administration.
Thanks.
Stephen Harris Rule with Pathpoint. I have another question about the 12%. The discount going from 16.9 to 12% is predicated on the full rate recommendations being implemented, which is, as I look at, around a 41% total cost increase. If the total cost is not increased by that amount and the 12% is kept in, then we're effectively lowering the amount of administration. So is there any thought about upping administration if the total rate increase is not adopted? Because otherwise you're effectively lowering it. That's one question on it. Well, I'll let you answer that.
So no, we don't have a contingency plan built in, so to speak, so that would presumably be part of the conversation when it comes to what, if any, part of the rate study moves forward. So I don't have a direct answer for you. But I mean, that question is certainly extends beyond administrative costs, right? It's, if the rates aren't fully funded, none of the, all the elements are going to be discounted, and it's going to have to be consideration about where those discounts are taken.
Right, but the administration was specifically lowered from 16 whatever to 12 on the basis that the whole thing would be funded. So it's a more of a cut to administration if it's not fully funded.
I understand the point you're raising, but it really comes, because these aren't mandates on providers, we're not saying that you're limited to 12%. It really becomes an operational decision for providers. If your rate goes up, of course there's no set rates today, but say that the rate's $30 and we're proposing a rate of $35. If the rate goes to $31, there's no requirement that you start spending less money on administration, right? I mean, a rate increase is a rate increase. You don't have to decide that you're going to cut somewhere else, even though your rates have been increased.
And did you consider the other question, and maybe this is getting too much, but some rates are proposed to go up a lot more than others. And in fact, the standard job coaching rate is going down by the model. Was there any thought to using your same methodology on the admin on a rate-by-rate basis rather than across the board?
No, there wasn't, and we really don't have data to support that specifically, because when we collected administrative costs, it was across all services, so we really don't know if one service has a higher administrative burden than the next. That's not the, we had a pretty lengthy conversation with the work group when we put the survey together, and we decided that we couldn't do it on a service-by-service basis, so we're just looking at it on the aggregate.
Question, Jordan Lindsay, going back to attendance, and I recall there was at some point a discussion about I presume 90% attendance. Is that correct, or am I making that up?
We have attendance factors built in for day programs.
Okay. And so discounted to the 90% attendance assumption.
I don't have that number committed to memory, but it will be in a slide coming up in terms of what that is. It was somewhere in that ballpark of 90%.
Under the scenario, let's say that somebody, a client, arrives, medical appointment comes up after 2/3 of the day. They have to leave. Overhead is still there, admin is still there, supervision is still there. In your model, is it built in that it continues to be a billable hour? Or no?
No.
However, the other costs still remain. Is that built into the rates?
No.
Okay.
Just Eric with UCP. One quick comment on the rate, the mileage rate set with the IRS. If you bake it into the rate, is it, when the IRS adjusts its mileage reimbursement, which may be low for ILS, but maybe more for other services, would that be automatically adjusted as well, or does it stay at the 58 cents per perpetuity because it would be adjusted with the rate? How does the IRS changes affect the rate?
Well, so I will tell you what my experience has been, and that few, if any, states automatically make adjustments because there's going to be fiscal implications associated with it. But that's one of the highlights or one of the benefits I presented in terms of approaching rates in this way, is that everyone knows what those numbers are. So right now the IRS mileage rate is 58 cents per mile. If it goes up to 60 cents per mile, there's no requirement, there's no mandate that the state increase the rate model, but everyone's going to know that it's funded at 58 cents and IRS has increased to 60 cents, and there's likely a compelling argument that can be made to pursue that. And of course, this is in the scheme of things, that's a relatively small issue. The same thing is true for a lot of our other data sources as well, BLS being a prime example of that. That is published on an annual basis, and although we've accounted for inflation, there's always an opportunity to true it up to see if our inflationary adjustment hit the mark or not, as that new data becomes available. Same thing is true in health insurance costs. For those of you running businesses, you know that health insurance increases, and $450 per employee per month. Some folks already said it's not enough today, but it's certainly not going to be enough 5 years from now. So having the rate models, detailing those assumptions, as well as the data sources, allows transparency for folks to know what those numbers are, and to, as appropriate, advocate for changes as that data becomes refreshed. But the bottom line is, and I don't speak on behalf of DBS on this point, but because of the fiscal implications associated with it, no state has things on autopilot. It always has to go through some sort of decision-making process in terms of whether or not that rate is going to be adjusted for new data.
I have a question on the travel time in between individuals. Is that for the whole week, or a 40-hour week?
Yes.
Okay. Because I jumped ahead and looked at the infant development program. Are we going to go over that specifically, or just this is the one example?
No. We will be going over that towards the end of the day.
Okay.
And I have been reminded, although it's right here in front of me, that I need to make sure that I'm reading off the rate models, or excuse me, the page numbers. So this rate model, for those following on a PDF, which I think is where most people are, is page 118 of the PDF. And so what I wanted to talk about now, without going through each of the individual regional centers, is again how those regional adjustment factors work. So you'll see if we go back up to the top of the page, we have that base rate model of $14.89 as an assumed wage. And so we've talked a couple of times now that the wage adjustment factor for category A is 95%. Alta has been assigned to category A. So you take the $14.89, you multiply by 95%, and that means the wage assumption there is $14.15 per hour. Then there's also adjustments to the travel time and travel distance. Refreshing my memory, Alta is assigned for the purposes of travel to category C, so that's the highest travel categorization, which has 125% multiplier value. So you'll see the time has gone up for both the number of miles driven as well as the length of time spent on travel. And then the final category for real estate doesn't apply to this particular service because it's not a center or facility-based service, so there is no real estate built in for direct service costs. So you'll see, based upon those two factors, the rate for Alta is going to be a little bit less because the wage has a bigger impact than the travel adjustment, and then the same methodology flows through for each of the other 20 regional centers, accounting for those two categorizations on the wages and travel side. So everything drives off of that base model. Base model is not a rate that would be paid anywhere, but it's the starting point to developing the regional center rates for each service. So again, from a rate modeling perspective, this model actually incorporates a lot of different services. It really is what we use when we're doing home-based or community-based services that are typically delivered on a one-to-one basis. So there's different rate models for every single service, which gives you the length of the packet itself, but I'm not going to walk through personal assistance or parenting support services or tutoring services, because from reading the rate model perspective, this is intended to be a primer to demonstrate how to read that. You can now go back to the rate models for the services that are relevant to you and reference back to the appendices as needed to determine whether or not you agree or disagree with any of our specific assumptions. So I don't want to walk through the rate models for each individual service, but I do want to walk through any sort of relevant factors for each individual service. So we will go back now to the PowerPoint presentation. So starting with personal assistance, and first providing an overview of these slides themselves, we spent some time talking about whether or not we made any relevant assumptions that colored our thinking for building rates. So tutoring services is the example I gave before, that we're assuming that it's going to be delivered, for example, by someone with a bachelor's degree. If I didn't tell you that, I don't think you could meaningfully evaluate the rate. For personal assistance, we're not presupposing anything that I don't think folks would ordinarily assume. This is helping people with their personal support, their ADL and IADL needs. So then the only information that's really conveyed on this particular slide is what the proposed billing unit is. So this was proposed to be billed on an hourly basis. And then what rate variance exists. And so this is a relevant section because we want to demonstrate the different ways that the rate can be modified, so to speak. So every one of the services, with one singular exception, has geographic variability built in. So when you see this list of rate variance, every one of them is going to have a bullet that says geography-based adjustments. So they're all subject to this wage, travel, and/or real estate categorizations. Most services, though not all, will also have a non-English stipend rate as well. And again, I covered that at the opening part of my remarks for folks who speak a language other than English and are receiving services from someone in their language. There's a higher rate offered, again, with the intent being that will be one strategy to help address disparities in the state. For personal assistance, although we envision it being a primarily one-to-one service, there are likely going to be times when it might be delivered to groups of individuals. So the rate models assume that allowable ratios will be 1 to 2 or 1 to 3. So those could be instances where you have roommates living together, spouses, siblings, and the like, where you have one direct care worker who's providing services to those 2 or 3 people simultaneously, and there's different rates associated with that.
Stephen Joy with California Respite Association again. We are extremely concerned about the rates that are set at the 1 to 2 and 1 to 3 because it looked in the document that you put out that it was at a lower rate and we always have to pay more to the workers in those scenarios. So, I just don't know.
Well, so the rate is lower, but the total earnings on a per staff person basis are higher because you're billing that rate for 2 or 3 people.
Right.
So it's a conversation that we've had in terms of what the appropriate middle ground is. We don't think it's appropriate to bill the full rate when you're serving people to 2 individuals.
Well, yes.
And then there are some states who simply divide the rate in half. So if the rate's $20, we're going to bill $10 for each person. We don't think either one of those strategies are appropriate. So we put in some premium to account for the fact that there's more complication associated with serving groups of individuals. But it's certainly not doubling, it's not allowing you to bill a full rate for both of those individuals.
Thank you.
That being said, again, just to make sure you have all the information you need to comment on this, those adjustments are not related to the wage assumption. So the wage assumption for 1 to 2 or 1 to 3 services is the same. There's other adjustments that we make that result in a higher per staff person revenue figure, but it's not on the wage. So if that's a concern of yours, that's something certainly you can put forward as part of the comment process.
Thank you, we will. Thank you.
And I guess I just want to, since I rambled there for a moment, I guess I just want to put the bottom line there. It is definitely the case that a provider will earn more money when they're serving 2 individuals than serving 1 individual on a per hour basis, but the question is whether it is enough more money or not.
It just looked like it was lower.
On a per person basis, the rate is absolutely lower, but you're going to be billing for 2 or 3 people, so you're going to be generating more revenue by billing for more people. And then the last element that we wanted to cover, or to me the last rate variance I should say for this particular service was our draft rate models assume there will be different rates based upon the length of the encounter. And so we've set that assumption at more or less than 6 hours. So if you're working with someone for 6 or more hours, you would bill what we've labeled the long-term rates, which is lower than the short-term rates. And the reason is brought up by someone a few moments ago. That is, if you're delivering services at 2 hours at a time, you're going to be serving more individuals, and that means you're going to have more travel time and more record-keeping documentation time. So in those examples, we want to make sure that we're providing a higher rate to accommodate those greater number of visits and really the reduction in billable hours. Whereas if you're doing a 6-hour visit with somebody, that likely is the extent of your shift. You're not going to be serving someone for 6 hours and likely going to serve someone else for another 8 hours. So that's the cutoff point that we established there.
Ian Silcher, Mainsel. The non-English stipend, where do you bill that? That's not built into the actual structure, correct?
It would be. It would be a different rate, and likely, again, there's a lot of operational decisions that would have to be made. I think that would be a subcode under the existing service code. And so, for the purposes of the rate model packet, we didn't want it to run 6,000 pages in length, so it's actually covered in Appendix E, and I think it's also summarized. We have a listing of all the rates at the very front of the packet, so you'll see what the bilingual rate is for each of these individual services.
Thank you.
Stephen, you mentioned earlier that the DSP, the different levels of DSPs that you were proposing based on the work of NADSP wasn't included in the fiscal estimate that we'll be seeing on Friday. Were assumptions related to the bilingual staff included in the fiscal assumptions we'll see on Friday?
Yes.
I'm trying to reconcile the long term for supported living. If we have somebody who is working with an individual for 6+ hours, and the next day they work with somebody for 3 hours, how do those rates reconcile? I mean, just in general, I mean, that's just one example of, you might have somebody who's working for 6 hours with one person and has to go and work with somebody for 3 hours the same day because the staff person didn't show.
Yeah, so in either one of those examples, you're going to be billing 6 hours of that staff person's time at the long-term rate and 3 hours of that staff person's time at the short-term rate. And for a given individual, it could vary from day to day as well, right? So an individual might have 6 hours of support one day and 2 hours of support the next day. So day one would be the long-term rate, day two would be the short-term rate.
So we'll have we're going to have different rates, like different purchase of services rates then?
Yes.
Hi, Stephen. Heather Flores here from Central Valley. I have a question. So our IOP rates currently are higher than what's proposed for my area. So it would be a loss of about $5 per hour for my providers. So is there a makeup of that in another section here that I'm missing?
I'm not sure what you mean by a makeup.
I'm just wondering, is there a supervisor section or something that makes up that difference somewhere, or is this all inclusive?
For that particular service, it's all inclusive.
Okay, so some of the rate models you're proposing, I just want to clarify, are less than what we're currently paying?
That's certainly going to be the case, yes. So, moving on to the next service I want to talk about is parent coordinated personal assistance. And what I want to do here is actually move back to the rate model packet. And for those following in the room or on the live stream, that's going to be on page 202 of the PDF. And so this is a little bit different than what's in the next slide actually related to personal assistance. This is supported living, but again, the premise is the same, so I wanted to share a couple points here, just like I did for independent living. So these are for the parent coordinated services, and we really followed a similar approach for each of these. So the first thing that you'll notice is we have the same hourly wage assumption. So regardless whether or not it's being provided through an agency model or a self-directed model, we think that the wage ought to be the same. Same thing is actually true for the benefits package, and this is something that varies from state to state in terms of whether or not they want to fully load benefits, and here it was decided that they did want to fully load benefits. Now, in terms of how that's operationalized, it's unlikely that the family employer is going to be offering health insurance directly. What we would envision is more likely to happen is that hourly wage would be higher, so that the person could go out and buy health insurance on their own if that's what they so desire to do. So we wanted to, again, not diminish the work that folks are doing when they're operating under a self-directed model, so we put in that full benefits package amount. So that includes health insurance and, of course, the cost of the payroll taxes and the like. We built in some productivity adjustments as well. Again, the concept here is you can't bill for that directly any more than an agency can bill for that directly, but you inflate the hourly rate that you've agreed to with the worker in order to accommodate these additional requirements that they have. And then the bottom line is we don't build in anything for program operations, supervision, or administrative expenses, but we have the same assumptions for wages and benefits. We put in some productivity, although not as much as we build in for the agency model because we envision them having somewhat different typical work weeks. So in this particular case, we have a rate of $22.17. So moving back to the PowerPoint presentation. So for parent-coordinated services like personal assistance, again, an hourly billing unit. It is also subject to the same geography-based adjustments. Again, the only thing that's I guess there are some cases where mileage might apply, so this would include both wage and travel-related assumptions. There would be the non-English rates available as well. And then just as there are for agency services, there would also potentially be instances where group services will be delivered on either a 1-to-2 or 1-to-3 ratio.
Hi, this is Geneva Ziare. So with a parent-coordinated personal assistance, do the parents get the POS directly from regional centers and there's no agency assistance on administering that?
I believe this is operated through the FMS system.
Okay. Through the so is it a voucher or?
Well, FMS is billed separately. There's standalone service codes, I think 490 and 491 for FMS, and no changes are being made to those rates as they exist today.
So that won't be built into the model?
It's not built into the model because it's billed in addition to.
Billed in addition to it, okay. Do you know if the FMS currently assumes any administrative costs to the?
Well, the whole function is administrative.
The whole function is administrative. So workers' comp, EDD, FMLA, CFRA administration, all of those things are assumed?
Well, so some of the payroll taxes are built into this rate model. The payment to the FMS itself is just for their administration, managing timesheets, managing payroll. The costs associated with the payroll taxes that they have to pay on behalf of the individual are built into the parent coordinated rate models themselves. Thought I saw another question a moment ago. Okay. So moving on, we have independent living, which is the rate model that I showed you, and I started with that just because it was the same thing that we talked about yesterday. So again, as you saw, an hourly billing units, and then the rate variance that would apply would be the geography-based adjustments, the non-English stipend, group services of potentially 1-to-2 or 1-to-3, and then the short-term and long-term encounters. So I don't want to, again, move on before people are ready, but from a rate modeling perspective, and then in terms of the rate variance, it really is similar to what we talked about a moment ago, so I don't have a whole lot to add here.
Excuse me, one more question. With FMS, and it's probably for DDS, who was the employer of the staff person?
Hi, this is Jim Knight, and it really depends on the model of the FMS that someone uses. It could be the individual, could be the employer, or the FMS may be considered a co-employer, so it really just depends on how that individual decides to set up their service.
Thank you.
Hi, Nancy Chance. I'm sorry, I have to go back. I don't understand the short and long-term encounters for supported living. I missed something. I'm sitting here trying to figure it out.
So the idea is that there's two different rates. A rate for encounters that last for 6 or more hours, and rates for encounters that last fewer than 6 hours.
In supported living?
Yes.
24-hour, 7-day-a-week service?
Well, so in that circumstance, those hours are going to be billed at the long-term rate.
Okay, so there's not going to be, you're looking at it per client, not per staff.
Absolutely. Well, it's per, It is per individual, yeah, the length of the encounter of the individual, but they're getting 24 hours of support, that's all.
Okay, I'm sorry, I got stuck. Sorry, thank you.
Michelle. You turn it off. So with, hello? Can you hear me? Oh, it's dead. It's dead.
Michelle, on my own. So with supported living, currently 2 regional centers in particular, we have varying rates, one for night rate. So because that's a night shift and it's paid at a lower rate currently, are you assuming that we would get the standard rate then and we would no longer have these lower rates for nightly rates since it's over the 6-hour short term?
We do not have different rates for overnight hours for supported living. So again, if someone's getting 24 hours of care, those hours will all be billed at the long-term rate.
So if the client had scheduled some, an outing, let's say, and it was typically longer than they were typically scheduled for a shorter term shift, we'd have to get prior approvals and things like that for the longer shift for that day in order to bill for that time?
So I don't have a firm answer to that particular question. It's one of the things that would really need to be worked out. And it is along the lines of what was brought up earlier in terms of how you would handle if the DSP tiers, if those were implemented, because that could be different from day to day based upon what staff person is serving a given consumer. Same thing is going to be true in this case. So I don't know if the individuals are going to need authorizations for both short-term and long-term services based upon what we think their year is going to look like, or if it's going to be possible to have a single authorization against which short-term or long-term services could be billed. And in that case, it becomes like a claims evidence issue, right? That if you try to bill a short-term rate for 8 hours in a day, that's going to reject. But again, there's some of these claims authorization and claims processing questions that still need to be resolved if these rate models move forward.
Okay, thank you.
Eric with UCP. One note, I'm looking at the independent living and then the respite. I don't have the PAs and others, but it looks like for a lot of these factors, record keeping, travel time, supervision of employees, those metrics are the same for all of those. So for example, just using record keeping and reporting, it looks like for ILS, it's 0.89 hours, and for respite, it's 0.89 hours. So it seems like a lot of those other factors are assumed for both service categories in this, but for ILS, you do session notes and reports. For respite, you don't. So my question is it intentional to apply those same metrics to most or all of those service codes that you're building out? Because from our perspective, a lot of those have very different amounts of, say, report writing time between respite and ILS and some of the other categories.
So I suppose the answer to the first part of the question is yes, it was intentional, and partly that is similar to the explanation I gave about program operations. Is when we looked at the provider survey results and the number of responses and the variability of responses, at times we were comfortable with making assumptions that span multiple services rather than having a whole lot of confidence in results for one specific service. So I certainly don't encourage folks to think about that overall and go back and take a look at what the typical billing work week looked like in the provider survey and how that compares to the rate model assumptions. But certainly if folks think that any one of those given assumptions ought to be adjusted, that's what the common process is for. And I guess I want to just pause for a moment because this is going to come up probably again in day programs. So we've raised the issue about handling the multiple levels of DSPs and the multiple short-term versus long-term rates. So I'll just share a perspective in terms of 2 ways that I've seen states accommodate this. The first matter is you truly need to have separate authorizations for, say, in this example, short-term and long-term services. So as part of the annual individualized planning process, you make an assumption about how many short-term hours someone's going to receive, you make an assumption about how many long-term hours they're going to receive, and then there's some likelihood that by the time you get to the 12th month, you're going to have to true things up a little bit. But that's if you have to do authorizations down to this discrete rate level. There's other states that create authorizations against which multiple services can hit against, so to speak. So you're authorized for independent living, $20,000 per year, and you can bill either the short-term or the long-term rates, and it all debits against, so to speak, that specific amount. But again, it has to do with the structure of your MMI system, and obviously there's a lot of other folks from Medicaid on down that have to sign off on that approach to reimbursement of services. So there's a couple different ways to get at it. We've had some preliminary conversations, because on day programs, for example, when we get there, we have different rates for center-based services versus community-based services. So there's going to be some manner to bill separately, whether it's short-term, long-term, whether it's community versus center, or whether it's DSP1 versus DSP2. So it's a conversation that's been started but not completed. I believe that takes me to independent living specialist. And so, much like the previous rate for independent living agency, hourly billing unit, the same rate variance. The rate models themselves are a little bit lower though, because we build in less operations and administrative expenses for the specialist services than we do for the agency services. But outside of that difference, things are largely similar. We have the same wage assumption for specialists versus agency employees, the same benefit package, et cetera. It really is differences on how we handle the overhead costs, those supervision, program operations, and administration. So that takes me to supported living, which a lot of folks have already jumped ahead on a little bit. But let me just take a half step back and reiterate a point that I made earlier in this conversation. So based upon the feedback that we received through various forums, the rates work group, and then some of the conversations we've had with providers throughout the course of this project, and certainly conversations with PDS, in very broad terms, we've identified two different modalities of delivering the support. And the language on the slide might be a little bit awkward, but I'm trying to be precise and thorough in terms of how we've differentiated it. So really, we're looking at two factors: whether or not it is continuous, that is to say 24-hour type of services. And when I say 24-hour, that might be discounted for participation in a day program, but it really means is a supported living provider responsible for an individual whenever that individual is not receiving some other support somewhere. And whether or not the staff are supporting one unit, housing unit, or multiple housing units. And again, that's where the awkward phrasing comes in, because it would be better to talk about this in terms of individuals. But I did want to discount the circumstance where you might have siblings who are getting intermittent supported living within the same housing unit, and that would not fall into our second rate, the community rate. It would still be what we would refer to as supported living individual rate. So let me try to walk through the second example first, because that is I think, relatively limited modality, and everything else falls into the former. So when folks are, or when a provider is delivering continuous support, 24-hour support, and staff are responsible for multiple individuals simultaneously, we've labeled that supported living community. And again, the example that I'm familiar with, having done site visits in other states primarily, is in the apartment complex model. You have multiple units within the same apartment complex, and staff are floating between those apartments. Oftentimes, there might even be a staff apartment that serves as their administrative office. And kind of the value of that model is if someone doesn't need hands-on support 24 hours a day, you don't need to be in their room or their apartment 24 hours a day, but you are on site at all times and are able to respond as needed. And oftentimes, there's a scheduled list of activities or check-ins on a regular or periodic basis. So that's that kind of two-pronged test. And they have to meet both of them. Is our staff responsible for multiple units, multiple front doors, so to speak, and is the support provided on a 24-hour continuous basis? If they don't meet both of those tests, they fall into the individual supported living, which is, based upon provider survey results, the primary way that services are being delivered. And based upon the feedback I've heard just today, I think that's really what most of us are talking about. And so we have those two different flavors, so to speak, and they're handled in two different parts of this presentation. So what we have here is the primary way of service delivery, where you're providing services behind one front door, ordinarily on a one-to-one basis, but there might be times when you have a sibling group or spouses or roommates who are sharing staffing support. So for this modality, it would be billed on an hourly basis, and much like we talked about with independent living in terms of what those rate variants are, we have geography-based adjustments, we have the non-English stipend, we have group services of 1-to-1 or up to 1-to-2 or 1-to-3. And then we also have the short-term or long-term encounters, which we've already talked about a couple of times. So if you're providing fewer than 6 hours of service in a day under supported living, we bill the short-term rate. If it's more than 6 hours, each of those hours would be billed at the long-term rate.
Did you guys consider IHSS services when you're looking at the short and long-term encounters? And is that included in the supported living? So if you had 6 hours of IHSS and 6 hours of supported living, is that considered short-term, long-term?
It's a good question. And right now, the way we've built up our modeling is just looking at supported living by itself. Whether or not that's the right answer or not, I don't know, but that's right now the predication that the rate models and the fiscal impact are built on. And partly that has to do with processing. I don't know that IHSS lives in the claims payment system, so from a claims edit perspective, it would be difficult to account for those hours.
Well, was it considered when you looked at 6 hours or less?
The consideration for the 6 hours really gets to, is a given direct care worker going to be working with more than one individual during a day? So that was really the thought process in terms of why that specific number was chosen. If you're working with one person for 6 hours, that likely constitutes the direct duration of your workday. Anything else here? State's spending about $1 billion on this service, so it's worthwhile to spend a moment or two on it.
Eric from Golden Gate. You thoroughly confused me with that explanation. So I just want to ask, so for 24-hour a day, one-to-one supported living, which is a decent amount of it, that would be the supported living one-to-one
Yes.
hourly rate times 24 hours a day?
Yes.
Okay, thanks, that cleared it up.
Westling, Association of Regional Center Agencies. I think some of the confusion is coming from even when an individual is supported 24 hours a day in SLS, it may be discounted by day program, as you mentioned, but the other thing that may be discounted by is the utilization of IHSS hours in lieu of supported living hours. And so I think the earlier question had to do with oftentimes there may be a singular staff who works and does SLS but is also the IHSS provider. And so how was that taken into account?
So we're not considering IHSS rates, for example, and I know you're not suggesting such. What we're really looking at is what the rate's going to be for billing for supported living. So if, in your example, again, whether or not this prevails or not, but the way we've done the modeling is, let's say someone gets 24 hours of support, there's no day program, but they're getting 6 hours per day of IHSS. So in that case, it would be 18 hours would be billed at supported living at the long-term rate. Then if we, to go back to the example that was raised earlier, if someone's just getting 12 hours per day, make sure this math works out to illustrate the point. If they're getting 12 hours per day, but 8 of those hours are billed at the IHSS and 4 hours are supported living, right now, and that's delivered by one staff person working a 12-hour shift, right now what we've assumed is those 4 hours, because it's just supported living, would be billed at short-term rate, although that was a 12-hour service encounter, because we're not taking IHSS into account in that sense. We're only talking about how much we're paying for supported living, and the short-term and long-term is based on how much of supported living specifically is being billed in the day. I guess is the simplest way that I can try to articulate it.
And so the encounter data, I think you said if someone is receiving 24 hours of support through some combination of day, IHSS, SLS, the encounter data would be billed at the long-term encounter rate, whether it was the same staff providing all of that support or different staff.
Yes, it would be based upon the number of hours of supported living being billed.
Michelle, again, the scenario that you just raised is concerning because as the employer of record, we are very heavily involved with IHSS and the administration and the coordination of hours and supervising the employee is extensive. And so to pay us a lower rate just because 8 of those hours are assigned to or paid by another agency, we still absorb that administrative burden of that cost. So to pay us a lower rate at the short-term rate doesn't make sense.
Well, what I said is actually just the opposite.
You said the opposite. Okay,
Well,
I misunderstood.
No, the short-term rate's the higher rate.
Yeah, short-term rate's the higher rate. Okay,
Yeah.
got it, sorry.
So it's actually true. That
Sorry, I
is
was
to your
confused.
benefit.
All right, thanks. Thank you.
So in the scenario you used, essentially you could have several different rates. You could have a short-term, long-term. If you shared staff on the overnight, you possibly could have a 1-to-2 ratio as well. So we're
Yes.
looking at several rates possibly for supported living.
Yes.
So currently for support living, we also receive emergency fund, admin, and mileage reimbursement. For the new model, would that still be included?
So the answer for mileage is no. That mileage is built into the supported living rate. I guess I'm not familiar with the emergency administration fund. I don't know what that means.
We have the coverage, which is $100 a month per client. If there's emergency, for example, the client couldn't go to day program, and we use the funding to provide extra care, provide staffing for the client during day program time.
Well, and under this model, it'd be hourly billing. So if you ended up providing staffing during the regularly scheduled day program, you'd be billing for those hours of service. And then,
so that would extra hours for emergency if client cannot go to day program, then we'll have to provide staffing.
From a rate model perspective, you bill for the hours of service that you provide.
And admin rate?
And the rate model itself includes administrative costs, so it's built into the rate. So
I saw last time, when you showed the scale, it didn't have the admin cost.
I think that's because we were talking about parent-coordinated supported living. The agency supported living most certainly includes administrative funds. And to circle back to the point that I mentioned earlier on that table, and the service code 894 would be eliminated because those administrative costs are wrapped into the supported living 896 service code. So my next slide is, in fact, for parent-coordinated supported living. We already saw the rate model. Again, same wage, benefit assumptions, regardless whether or not someone works for an agency or not, both across the specialist as well as across the parent-coordinated or self-directed models. In terms of the rate variance that apply here, geography-based adjustments, the non-English stipend is applicable, and then group services are up to 1-2 or 1-3.
Hi, Stephen. Heather here from CVRC again. If I may go back a moment, I'm still stuck on ILP. My question is, some of the SLS rates are identical to the ILP rates. And ILP is a training program that's teaching people new skills so that they can more successfully live independently. And SLS, I've always equated with more of a personal assistance model, people who require support and care. Not that they're not doing training, it's just they've always been viewed as two different models, so I'm really confused why the rates would be the same. Can you help me understand the philosophy behind that?
Well, and we had some conversation about this and whether or not we ought to effectively discount the supported living rates and build a lower wage assumption that matches what we built in for personal assistance. And ultimately, the desire was not to reduce that wage assumption, because that's what the result would be. The independent living rate would not go, wage would not go up, the supported living rate would go down. And we talked about doing that and ultimately opted to maintain parity between those two wage assumptions across those two services.
Okay, so effectively you've discounted the ILP rate?
No, just the opposite. We've promoted, so to speak, the SLS rate. The ILP rate would stay where it's at. It's based upon the DSP buildup that we've done elsewhere. So if you look at what we built in for personal assistance, although I didn't go through the rate model, that 062 code, we had a lower wage assumption than the 1489 there. The 1489 applies to the DSP type services in a residential model, in a day program model, or in an in-home model like ILP. So those numbers won't change. What would happen is we would, if we took your premise that supported living is more personal assistance driven, we would take that wage assumption down to what we have built into the other personal assistance rates.
I'm sure my mind will continue to try to wrap my mind around this because I'm just not seeing how the ILP rate can be reduced so much compared to what it already is currently when it's a training model.
Well, that's a different question, but so let me try to make this clear. And I don't have the number in front of me, but let's just consider ILP and personal assistance. For ILP, our wage assumption, as we've established, is $14.89. For personal assistance, and don't quote me on getting this right to the penny, but I think it's like $14.10 or $14.20. And so the question for us became, which of those wage assumptions do we think we ought to use for supported living? And this was a conversation that we had. Should we put it at the personal supports rate, the personal assistance rate of $14.20 and some change? Or should we put it at the rate that we're using for day programs, residential programs, and in-home services like independent program of $14.89? And we made the decision to put it at the $14.89. We chose the higher of those two options that were under consideration.
I have no objection to SLI's rate being higher. I mean, right now as it's funded, it's a losing proposition for our providers if you break it down to the hourly rate. So something like that could be a positive. But reducing the rate for ILP seems, it just seems almost punitive. So I'm just curious, are we trying to move away from that model? What's the goal there?
Well, so again, we're not making targeted attacks or rewards for specific services. We're building rates that we think reflect the cost associated with it. So I'm certainly sympathetic to the point that you're making, but that's why we're putting forward the rate models in the level of detail that we're putting them forward. So you know what we built in for wages, you know what we built in for benefits, for productivity, for overhead costs. So now what we're asking for is feedback on those specific topics, not just we don't think this rate ought to be cut or this is punitive. It's what are those specific assumptions do you think we perhaps wanted to stray on so that we can reconsider whether or not that revisions ought to be made. And that's the point of having, that's the very point of having this public comment process and going through these day-and-a-half presentations so that I can walk you through the rate models. You can understand exactly how we run at the bottom line. So it's not a conversation of you saying you think the rate ought to be 40 and I think the rate ought to be 35. You can tell me that I think this wage assumption ought to be different, or this benefit package, or there ought to be more mileage, or more record keeping time, or whatever else we've already talked about here today. And that's what we're hoping to accomplish, both this week as well as in the following 3 weeks where we're having these public comments.
Sir, thank you.
Beth from Monarch ILS. Something just to consider for the differentiating between ILS and SLS in terms of weight, the difference or similarity for the rate, is that SLS, the cap for how many hours the client gets of SLS is very different than of ILS, so the amount of case management, because there's more clients, because there's less hours, is pretty significant for ILS. And ILS has been going for some time without the administrative operations being taken into consideration. So that's just something that might want to be considered, is that, you know, at least at our local regional center, the cap on ILS is 24 hours a month. And so a lot of times if somebody needs more than 24 hours a month, they're referred to a supported living agency instead. And so if those wages are the same, that's going to drastically impact how what services people are referred to. So that's just something to keep in mind as well.
Thank you.
Job coach, please.
Wendy Farkas.
Just in the conversation, I think that the part that is significantly different between supported living and ILS, and really not so much the wage, is the mileage. Supported living, as we've been talking, staff generally go to one location and they work 6 or more hours. ILS tend to be shorter, 2 to 3, maybe 4 hours at a time. And so they're traveling a great amount of their day between the different locations. So I think really the issue would be in the ILS rate is adequate mileage and drive time included. If the rates are the same between ILS and supported living, I would go to the side of there needs to be more mileage and drive time in the ILS rate.
Thank you. So, a couple more services to get into this particular section, and then we'll take a brief break. Parenting support services. So, one assumption that we're making in the development of the rate models that's different than what exists today because there aren't regulations around the service is that in order to deliver the service, staff are going to need to have a bachelor's degree in a public health or education field. And so that's not to say that staff who are currently doing this who don't meet those qualifications have to stop delivering services, but they would have to start going under a different service code. So they would no longer be qualified to deliver services under 108. Outside of that, from a rate model perspective, there's not a whole lot of moving parts to this. Hourly billing again, and then we have geography-based adjustments as well as group services with allowable ratios of 1 to 2 or 1 to 3. For tutoring services, I already mentioned one of the presumptions that are included in the rate model that's different than, yes.
Amy Westling, Association of Regional Center Agencies. I apologize, I have the terrible habit of letting you change slides and then asking a question about the slide you just left. So in parenting support services, given the change in the qualifications to require someone to have a bachelor's degree in public health or education, I think you said that if the current staff doesn't have that qualification, they would need to build the service under ILS. But parenting support isn't one of those services currently allowed under our ILS model. So this just brings up a broader question about have you considered or will there be an outline of the various regulations and statutes that need to be changed to implement some of these models?
So the generic answer is yes, there's been consideration given to statutes and regulations are going to need to be changed in terms of is there a finalized or even at this point, to be honest with you, a draft list? No. But that's very much on the radar because, as you point out, a lot of this are predicated upon those sorts of changes. So that just speaks to the complexity of what it is that we're doing. And I wanted to make sure in the presentation you know what those presumptions are. And so for tutoring services, I mentioned at the top that we would be, again, assuming the rate models assume and would require that folks have a bachelor's degree in a related field that they're tutoring in. And then the other change that is presumed is that it would be limited to adults who are pursuing post-secondary education. So again, if you have tutoring services being delivered to children, which is actually, from a POS perspective, I think the majority, or at least close to half the total spending, that would need to be billed under a different service code. Other than that, from a again, rate model perspective, the rate model part of this is pretty easy. Hourly billing, we have rate variance based upon geography, based upon bilingual, or non-English stipend, and then the group size, up to 1 to 3. For respite services, one of the things that we heard from the rates worker really in one of our first meetings was the differences in cost between an agency model and an employer of record model. So what we've assumed in the rate models is that we would have two different rates, an agency rate and then an employer of record rate, and then an employer of record rate would be equivalent to what you actually talked about on the next slide, which is that participant-directed or self-directed respite services. On the employer of record side, that would be billed kind of what we spoke about earlier with other services, that there would be billing the services at the participant-directed rate, and then that agency would need to be vendored as an FMS in order to bill the administrative component of providing those supports.
So with the parent participant directed portion of respite, is there a program support component to that?
No. What would be billed would be the FMS, which is intended to cover the agency administrative and operations costs. Again, from a rate modeling perspective, these all kind of follow the same pattern. So the conversation is really more around the presumptions that we made, but from a rate perspective, geography-based adjustments, the non-English stipend, group services of up to 1 to 3, and then the short-term and long-term encounters, again defined as more or less than 6 hours per day.
Quick question on the back slide, sorry. In all of these services, is it then now you need to have an FMS component to provide these services?
No, not for all of these services, for participant-directed services or employer of record.
Okay.
Then we have participant-directed respite, which would be provided through an FMS. Again, hourly billing, I don't have the rate model, but it assumes the same wage assumptions, the same benefit assumptions, and then some productivity, but not the same productivity as agency respite includes, but no program operations or administrative costs built into that rate model, as that's part of the FMS.
And with the FMS, sorry, this is Geneva again. So with the FMS, it's not being under consideration for having that rate reviewed with this rate model?
There's no draft rate model being offered for FMS, so the rates would be as they exist today. As I recall, it's a 3-tiered model based upon the number of services being provided to the individual. It's a monthly rate. I don't recall off the top of my head what those dollar amounts are, though.
So there's no regional considerations or any of those considerations that were done?
Not part of the draft rate models being presented, no.
Okay, is there any, is that going to happen in the future? Is that under consideration at all?
Yeah, at this time, like Stephen said, it's not part of the rate study, so they are anticipated to be what they are as now.
Wrapping up with two final services. We have what's currently referred to as Homemaker, and there's two technically different service codes, although only one of them is used, 858 and 860. Based upon our reading of the regulations around these, as well as our interaction with providers, it doesn't fall into what we would have thought a Homemaker service is. It sounds more like a companion or personal assistance type of service. But as part of our conversation, we identified the value of having a more traditional housekeeping or chore service. So that's what's being proposed. We included it with Homemaker, although I think it's probably not a clean one-to-one relationship. I think a lot of what's being built under Homemaker today is not going to be housekeeping. It's going to be under personal assistance or potentially like independent living or supported living. But the housekeeping service would be just for that very purpose, is to help with routine household tasks, cleaning and chores. For that reason, it would also be relatively limited in scope. It would be limited to 3 hours per week for an individual. Again, from a rate model perspective, pretty straightforward, an hourly billing unit with geography-based adjustments as well as group services. And then lastly, we have the supplemental program supports for other services. So this is the non-day and non-residential supplemental program support. Not a whole lot being proposed there differently. We have hourly billing, and we have rate variance based upon geography, as well as the non-English stipend.
So I have a question. This is Lisa Gonzalez from Deaf Plus Adult Community. So the homemaker parts, I noticed that there was no non-English stipend on that one that you mentioned in that category. Is that an oversight or?
So
what's the reason for it?
So it was not an oversight, because our vision of this is transition to a housekeeping service where there does not need to be interaction necessarily with the individual receiving services. It is to do cleaning and chore types of activities. So that was the premise around not having a non-English stipend. If it's what's being billed under homemaker, if it's a companion service or personal assistance, it would no longer fall under housekeeping. It would move to the personal assistance code or an independent living code, which does include the non-English stipend.
Thank you for clarifying that.
So that takes me through the personal supports and training services. We're not doing quite as well on time yesterday, but I think folks probably need a break. So let's take 10 minutes, and we do want to get started right at 10 till 11.
You ready to go? Oh, you want something else? Nope.